Hey guys, John here from Sonic Drive Studio. I hope you're all doing well. I recently did another blind test video in which we compared my Marshall JCM 800 Studio tube amp, my Line 6 Helix, my FRACTAL Audio XFX3, and my brand new Kemper stage. If you haven't seen that video yet, definitely check that one out first. I'll put a link in the description and up here somewhere. Okay, so as some of you might remember, I also did another blind test recently in which I compared my Mesa Boogie dual rectifier to a mystery modeling platform that turned out to be the Line 6 Helix. In that case, a fairly large portion of the viewers could not guess which one was the real amp. Another big portion of those viewers did guess the amp correctly, but I guess it's safe to say that the differences between the real amp and the modeler in that case were quite subtle to most people's ears anyway. In the case of this test, I feel like I can hear the differences in between the modelers and the amplifier a little bit clearer, but I'm totally biased because I'm the one who created this test. And also please note that I'm not yet aware of what you guys thought since I'm recording this before I release the original blind test video. But of course I'm still dying to find out. Now before we go on with the test results that you're all waiting for, I just want to say one thing. And that is that when we judge these results, we have to keep in mind that the amp models in the Helix and the XFX were not based on the exact same version of the JCM 800. I used the 20 watt studio version with the two EL34s in the power section, and the amp models were based on the 2204 50 watt Marshall JCM 800. So there are bound to be some sonic differences because of that fact alone, but even between real amps of the same model, there can also be some sonic variation, so we also have to keep that in mind. But obviously the Kemper profile was based on my exact amplifier with the exact same settings. Okay, so let's get to the results of the blind test right now. Are you guys ready? A was the Helix, B was the XFX3, C was the Kemper profiler, and D was my real Marshall amplifier. Pretty interesting, huh? I wonder how many of you got all of them right. Again, I feel like I can hear the differences between them all, and I think I would be able to identify which one is which in a blind test, but I'm merely speculating because it's impossible for me to look at this objectively since I'm the one who created this test. I guess you could say they all sound pretty close, and they all would sound good in a full mix. Okay, so now let's go over each platform, look at the settings, and talk about the sound. Let's start out with the real Marshall amplifier, and first we're going to take a listen to that in a full mix. Alright, that sounded great to my ears. Let's take a look at the settings. So these were the settings that I used for the real amp. I used the high sensitivity input because you really can't get enough gain with the low sensitivity input. Presence, bass, mid and treble were set to 6. The master was set to 2.3-ish. This is a point on my amplifier where the power tubes start working, but where they're not completely compressing and darkening up the signal yet. So it's a sort of sweet spot for my personal taste. Gain was set at around 8. Plenty of gain for a good crunch, but still pretty clear sounding, because the amp gets a bit bassier when you turn the gain up to 10. The amp is being fed into my usual FRACTAL audio load box, and I'm using an Ownhammer impulse response from the Revolution series. I'm using the 412 MRCB cabinet with the V30-EN1 speaker option, and I'm using the Classic 1 mic mix. And do note that I'm using that exact same impulse response for each platform in this video, of course. Alright, now let's take a listen to the Helix in a full band mix. Here we go. I used the 2204 amp model in Helix native, and here you can see the settings that I used. I had to do some tweaking to get it to sound as close as possible. I adjusted the basic EQ, the gain, the master volume, and the bias. I felt like the real amp perhaps had slightly more clarity. The Helix model sounded a little bit more rounded off in the transients, like a gentle saturation. It does sound very nice though, and I definitely would use this in a mix. And the differences we're talking about here are quite subtle indeed. And of course I'm using that exact same Ownhammer impulse response in the cab block. So yeah, a very simple and basic setup, but a great sound. Now let's check out the Brit 800 amp model in the Fx3 in a full mix. Here we go. Okay, so let's check out the settings that I used. To get this one to sound closer to the real amp, I had to do a little bit more tweaking on this platform than on the Helix, for example. Overall, this amp model seemed to have more low end and more bite and clarity in the upper register, so more definition basically, even more than the real amplifier. I guess you could say that in comparison to the other platforms, the Fx sort of sounds a little bit harsh. Don't get me wrong, it still sounds great, but it's maybe not as pleasing as the other ones in this particular test. However, Fractal Audio has said in the past that the amp that they based this model on was very bright sounding, so it does make sense. And of course, you can tweak the Fractal Audio amp model to your heart's content. So these are the basic settings in the amp block. To tame the brightness a little bit, I had to go to the bright cap settings to lower them a bit. To get the overall EQ curve to sound closer, I went into the speaker tab as well, and here I lowered the low frequency resonance a bit. I started off with the impedance curves from the LB2 load box that I also used with the amp. And then in the output EQ, I also tamed some upper mids, only a small touch, and I added some 8K to make the amp breathe a little bit more. And you might ask, why didn't you just tone match the amp, John? Well, I could have done that and the results probably would have been closer. But I feel like most people who buy an XFX3 or FM3 for that matter, they just want to plug in, choose an amp model, and they expect it to sound great, or at least they expect it to sound like a real amp right away. To tone match an amp, first you'd have to have that real amp to begin with, and most people who own an XFX or FM3 probably don't. And it's not just basic tweaking, it's a little bit more advanced than that. Also keep in mind that a tone match block is great at replicating the overall EQ curve of an amplifier, but it's not able to recreate or match the gain structure of the amplifier. Anyway, so that was just my decision this time. Maybe next time I will do a tone match, we'll see. Alright, and finally let's check out the Kemper stage in a full mix. Here we go. Alright, so obviously I profiled my real amp with the exact same settings and setup as the real amplifier, and I think it sounds pretty close. In my experience, the Kemper can often do a great job at profiling a real amplifier. Other times it's a little bit less accurate depending on some factors. In the case of this profile, I feel like the sound is a little bit more compressed, so it sounds as if there is a little bit more gain going on. As if there's a compressor going on before the distortion. So sure, it's a subtle difference, but I can't deny that I am hearing a little bit of a difference there. To make the profile sound even closer to the real amp, I did add in a little bit of bass and a touch of clarity as well. Alright, I guess that's it, folks. I think they all sounded great and they all would work well in a mix. They all sound pretty close overall, aside from some pretty small and subtle differences. But of course I would love to know your thoughts as well. Were you right or wrong about which one was which? Were there any standouts to you? Was the real amplifier the best sounding to your ears, or perhaps one of the modeling platforms? I'd be very interested to hearing your thoughts, so be sure to drop a comment down below. Also, if you haven't already, please hit subscribe along with the bell. And you can also follow Sonic Drive Studio on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Cheers!